Moving on to our next crystal sphere, and this one is a huge one, by the way. Natural selection. Mind you, I wrote a book called 10 Irrefutable Proofs of Creation. Natural selection? Really? I use natural selection as an irrefutable proof of creation? I thought that Charles Darwin came up with natural selection. So how can we say that natural selection proves creation when the chief of all evolutionists came up with natural selection, the man who put into our minds that there is no God and that there's evidence against God and that the world cannot possibly be created by God? Natural selection is an irrefutable proof of creation, and indeed, especially in this day and age, is what I would call a crystal sphere in the scientific realm. Next one, too. There is a difference between natural selection and evolution. It's exactly what we're getting at here. Mind you, Charles Darwin, when he did his research and kind of uncovered the phenomenon of natural selection, a lot about genetics he was unaware of. But as we've studied natural selection more and more, we've noticed that it and evolution are two different things. Evolution, in a broad sense, means change over time. Natural selection, in all reality, is not a force of change at all. Natural selection has some very defined boundaries. And this is the most recent scientific data we're talking about here. Now, there's still plenty of imagination, mind you. I don't want to humor you into thinking that anybody has that once believed in the theory of evolution is now disowning it because of these limitations we found. Instead, you just have to get a little more creative with the way that you think in order to make it work. But natural selection does have some very definite boundaries, and that being the genetic code itself, that natural selection only operates inside the genetic code. Evolution, as we understand it, brings forth totally new creatures. Natural selection preserves old creatures. Now, this is totally the opposite, I'm sure, of what you've been taught in school. Natural selection, from all of our study of it, never produces anything other than the creature that it started off with. Now, it might be a fruit fly with 4 wings, or it might be a bacteria that's resistant to a certain antibiotic, but nonetheless, it remains the same thing at the end. Bacteria remains bacteria, fruit flies remain fruit flies, and so forth. That nothing ultimately, there's no net change in natural selection. In fact, even Darwin's finches, given the appropriate amount of time, if you're familiar with Darwin's finches, if not, I recommend that you read about them a little bit because it's a fascinating story nonetheless, and it is a very good example of how Darwin uncovered the phenomenon of natural selection. But it was discovered that the finches that he was observing had been experiencing a massive drought. And it was the ones with the thicker beaks that were able to break through the seas that were necessary to hydrate these birds. And so those are the ones that end up surviving. The other ones end up dying off. Now, once the conditions changed back to the way they were, those ones with thick beaks started to become minimal, and the other ones became the dominant species once again. And so there's no net change really. It just goes, it's an oscillation depending on favorable circumstances. And even then, that doesn't always hold true depending on how long those circumstances prevail. Like, for instance, we don't all grow long hair because it's the summer or because it's the winter time, and shorter hair because it's the winter time. So just, again, there are time constraints there. Evolutionary changes, that we understand them, are permanent. Natural selection is oftentimes temporary, as I just outlined there. Next one. So how does natural selection prove a creator? Well, as I mentioned before, it defines the boundaries of evolution itself. We never observe a Great Dane mating successfully with a mountain lion and getting some sort of a mixed breed. They're totally different kinds of animals there. And because of that, they are limited with their reproductive capabilities. Dogs can reproduce with other dogs, and the big cats can reproduce with other big cats, but they can't go across the specific type of animal that they are and reproduce. We've never seen a lizard reproduce with a bird, for instance. And because of that, we see the boundaries within the theory of evolution itself And natural selection helps us to define those. It allows the survival of different types of creatures. So we look back at Darwin's finches, as I mentioned before, that without the ones with the thicker beaks, and mind you, this is all within the confines of genetics. Those beaks did not arise because of any new genetic information. They arose because those birds actually already had those beaks, and the other ones were dying off because they just simply could not survive given the circumstances. And so it was actually a creature that had been allowed to be preserved and survive, opposed to the entire race, if you don't mind me using that word, the entire race of birds dying off as a result of the drought. It confirms that no creature yields anything other than its own kind, as I already mentioned. Natural selection never seems to progress upward, only downward. Now this causes a huge problem here, because Darwin's theory does not explain the origin of life. It can only explain, to some degree, change in life as it exists. We only really observe, at the very best, a preservation of the genetic code from organism to organism as it reproduces. But sometimes we observe either mutated genes, which oftentimes result in sterile creatures, or we observe a loss of information, that something doesn't get transcribed right within the whole reproductive process, and as a result of that, the next generation is missing something that it once had before. And lots of times these are people that are disabled. You see somebody who was born without limbs or whatever. That's as a result of this lost information. And so we only have evidence that if you want to call it that, evolution can go downward, but it never goes upward. Another clear boundary from natural selection. And once again, it only operates among living organisms, which is a great hindrance to the origin of life itself from an evolutionary perspective. Life cannot come from non-life, so where did life come from in an evolutionary model? And natural selection can only be observed operating in the world of the living. So don't be confused. Natural selection and evolution are two totally different concepts. I'm not a biologist, but I've actually talked to biology friends of mine and argued these points. As a matter of fact, I didn't even do that good in biology class, by the way. But I've argued these points with people that do know biology, and they're very simple concepts, and they cannot come up with any examples whatsoever of new information or new creatures resulting as a result of natural selection. They can't cite anything. So evolution and natural selection are two totally different concepts.